Good morning. Thank you all for joining today. I really appreciate you here. We have a wonderful panel here today to talk about the film Wake Up. Before we get into the questions, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. Michael Zibilich is a suicide awareness advocate and speaker, founder of the Keller Zibilich Sigma Chi Lifeline program, and one of the subjects featured in the film Wake Up. After his son Keller died by suicide in 2012, Michael and his wife Gail have dedicated their time and resources in promoting suicide education and awareness. Over the last 4 years, Michael has spoken to thousands of university students about suicide awareness. His message is simple: in the fight against suicide, all of us must consider ourselves first responders in our own lives and in the lives of those that we know. Dr. Craig Bryan is a board-certified clinical psychologist in cognitive behavioral psychology, an internationally recognized expert on suicide prevention, trauma, and resilience. He is currently the Ohio State University College of Medicine Director of Recovery and Resilience, is a military veteran, and thank you for your service, and one of the subjects featured in the film Wake Up. Zan Barry is a licensed clinical psychologist in Massachusetts with nearly 2 decades of experience delivering programs to support overall well-being. Currently, she has her own private practice as a clinical psychologist, is a national board certified health and wellness coach, and has completed training in several suicide education and risk reduction programs. Zan is also a mindfulness teacher who specializes in stress management and has worked with top-tier universities to promote mental health and wellness coaching and counseling. And Javier Vargas is a certified peer specialist and works at Vinfen as a healthy transitions peer coordinator. Over the past 4 years, Javier has worked to support young adults with mental health challenges in the Lowell, Massachusetts area. As a queer and trans non-binary person who spent most of their life growing up in Lawrence, doing work locally for their community has always been very important. Thank you and welcome. To start, I'm going to ask a question of the panelists. Michael, what inspired you to be a part of this film? And if there's one message that you hope the audience takes away from this, what would that be?
Marc, thank you very much. Frankly, our inspiration came from the young people that were involved in starting Project Wake Up. Alex Lindley, Danny Kurth, and an incredible group of young people that were touched by tragedy in their own personal lives while in college, and decided at that moment that they were going to make a real difference in life, and started a quest which is still going on right now, and also was involved in, of course, the movie Wake Up. They solicited a great young man, Nate Townsend, to do the film. And when we evaluated their bona fides and their dedication to doing something, we decided that Keller's story would be told in a correct manner, in an inspirational manner. So we decided to be a part of it, and every second since that decision was made, we have been so incredibly happy to have been a part of this wonderful, very hopeful film. As far as what is one thing that one message that I would like someone to take from the film, it really breaks down, I think, into 3 parts, which I try to transmit every time I have an opportunity to speak at high schools, at colleges, or other places. And it's a very simple 3-part, and it's something that a lot of times many of us do not think about. My wife and I did not think as much about it as we should have at the moment. That mental health is absolutely just as important as your physical health. Number 2, it is not a sign of weakness. Frankly, it is a sign of strength to talk about your problems. And I guess most importantly is that mental health disorders, problems, challenges are treatable. There is help, there's hope, there's life.
Thank you. And Craig, I'm going to ask you the same question about what inspired you to be a part of this film, and if there is one takeaway that you hope the audience gets, what would that be?
Yeah, for me, the big inspiration was the opportunity to, in many ways, sort of pull the curtain back on therapy and trauma therapy. We are actually getting really, really good at helping people recover from trauma, from PTSD, but that really isn't known. Though the treatments that are highly effective, most people have not heard of, most clinicians are not trained to do them. And so when I was first approached, I really saw this as an opportunity to, provide some insight in this sort of mysterious black box of trauma therapy, of what's actually happening and what actually is that pathway to recovery for many. And so that's in many ways what I hope the audience takes away from this, is that there are highly effective treatments for PTSD and trauma. There are highly effective treatments that we know prevent suicidal behaviors, and we're getting better at this.
Thank you. And Zan, what do you think is the most important aspect of this film as it pertains to the work that you do?
So thank you, Marc, for that question. So working with young adults, the kind of college age population, I think the idea that it's okay to talk about this, that peers can discuss with each other how they're feeling, that it's neither going to say implant an idea in someone. If you bring up that you're concerned about them, it's not going to implant the idea of taking one's life. It's actually a way of reducing or relieving anxiety about that topic by bringing it up. So the fact that people are open and honest and authentic in the film seems like a great stride forward in being able to reach out to each other, to be authentic with each other, and to prevent, tragedy from happening.
And Javi, what do you think is the most important aspect of the film as it pertains to the work that you do and the people that you work with?
Yeah, thank you, Marc. I think that one of the most important aspects is definitely like being aware, especially for non-LGBTQ people, being aware of those statistics, but also being aware that we feel these ways not because we hold certain identities, but rather because of the ways in which the world, but especially the United States, can be a very inhospitable place for us to grow and to be successful and to be authentic with ourselves. So I think that for me, that was a huge, not just a huge takeaway, but in my work, I work on young adults in their resilience against, the transphobia, the homophobia, the queerphobia, so that they can navigate the world with a sort of coat of armor, even though I obviously wish they didn't have to, and I wish I didn't have to, but so that they can, and we can navigate the world with this sort of coat of armor that protects against many of the everyday things that we see and we encounter and we experience.
Okay. And there are many drivers and factors leading up to suicidality. And to preface the next group of questions, I want to share an analogy of a backpack and how I view toxic stress. And if you think about a backpack, and throughout the day, whatever stressor you encounter, you're putting rocks in your backpack. At a certain point, that backpack becomes too heavy to carry. Each of us on any given day wake up, and some of us have our backpack already half full. Some of our backpacks are already at the breaking point. Some of us have empty backpacks. It's that last rock that we put in that tips the scale of when we can no longer cope, when our coping resources are completely overwhelmed and we have no other options. It's that point that I think about certain solutions to those problems, such as suicide, such as self-harm, such as other ways of coping, are actually a solution to that problem for many people. And so, Javi, I'm going to ask you first, how does toxic stress or trauma factor into the work that you've done relating to suicide prevention? and the population that you work with, particularly with young adults, people of color, of the LGBTQI community?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Mark. I think that when we think about marginalized communities like young adults, like Black folks and people of color, and like LGBTQ and queer and trans folks, I think toxic stress is just sort of an everyday thing, right? So to think about, for example, a trans person that goes outside and has to run errands and they're getting misgendered every day, they're getting weird looks, they're getting all of these things, which are also things that like I definitely experience at different points in times, depending on how I walk out the door, right? So, and also for Black folks, thinking about like the insidious ways in which racism works and anti-Blackness works, when you're navigating systems that are like structurally racist and structurally transphobic, and you're encountering people that have not done a lot of unlearning and relearning about these kinds of things, then you're constantly coming up against these violences, and you come to expect it at a certain point. And when you come to expect it and you don't have resources to share that and to navigate that, then it becomes, like you're saying, suicide and self-harm become like the only option, because it feels like there's no way out. It feels like, even if you do talk to most people, especially when we're thinking about places, even in Massachusetts, where there are very little cohesive Black and trans communities, all of these sort of marginalized communities. So when you can't share in community all of these things, especially, and you're suffering alone through all of these things, and you feel like no one is going to understand because everyone has sort of like, everyone has not done this unlearning and relearning and understanding, then it feels like the only way out. And so with a lot of the young adults that I work with, it's really also showing them that there are a lot of us, there are a lot of us that experience this, and talking about it with other people that experience it can also be super helpful, because it doesn't make it go away, but it also makes you feel like you're not alone.
Thank you. And Zan, how does toxic stress factor into the work that you've done with suicide prevention, in particular to your work with students and young adults?
Well, just to follow on what Javi said about, it starts to feel like the world is, the tunnel vision is closing in, and this starts to seem like the only way out. Anything we can do to widen that tunnel vision and to start to see a sense of community and to start to see a sense of allyship or camaraderie or connectedness. Connection heals toxic stress, and we can, toxic stress can be de-escalated as much as it gets escalated, and connection is what de-escalates. So building a sense of connection, and reflection are ways of starting to relieve that last rock that you talked about and bring, start to unpack.
Thank you. And Michael, how does toxic stress factor into the work that you do?
Thank you very much, Mark. Obviously, the vast majority of the speaking that I do is on college campuses, a lot to do with fraternities. And of course, I speak for Active Minds, which obviously is a co-ed audience as well. I don't think there's ever been a time in at least my lifetime that there is this much stress and anxiety associated with expectations with regard to being in college. This has been accentuated, of course, by the conditions that we've all experienced the last 2 to 3 years with the pandemic. And it's been further accentuated by what goes on social media, obviously a part of all of our lives right now, and a very positive force in many ways, but at the same time, an opportunity to present worlds that in many instances are not true and real. These young people are under an enormous amount of stress in their everyday lives. I can see it when I speak to mixed groups as well as fraternities, and I can see it in their faces and in their conversations that there is not a lot of places for them to turn, or they are not aware of where to turn to. And our message is, frankly, very simple with regard to that, is trying to make them aware of the resources that are available, at the universities and schools, and to encourage them to engage the people that they go to class with, the people that they're in organizations with, teams, the people that they live with, and that mental health becomes something that they consciously think about and seek help from.
Thank you. And Craig, how does toxic stress or trauma factor into the work that you're doing, particularly with veterans?
Yeah, so I think, that as was highlighted with the two veterans featured in the film, trauma is very commonly a sort of a driving force for suicidal desire and suicidal behaviors for many veterans. One the key consideration, I think, a misunderstanding about veteran suicide is I do think there's an assumption that trauma is the primary driver for most veteran suicides. We actually know that the majority of veterans who kill themselves have never been deployed, have never experienced combat. They might have experienced other forms of trauma, though, in their lives. And so I think what our research has been showing over the past few years is we're sort of trying to get people to broaden that perspective of veteran suicide. It's not just the veterans who have returned from adverse conditions downrange, but it's also now we see the kind of highest risk group right now in active duty military are actually very young service members between the ages of 18, 21. They've never been deployed. And in many cases, it's environmental factors that seem to be a major pressure. It's institutional stressors, it's community related stressors, it's separation from family members, friends, things like that. And so a lot of our newer directions in suicide prevention with the military and veteran community are really kind of looking at this bigger picture of what's happening in the environment that's contributing to these very high levels of stress.
Thank you. For the next questions, we talk a lot about inpatient hospitalizations as being an intervention for suicidality. And there are many systemic issues, and oftentimes involuntary hospitalization can be very traumatizing for people. With that being said, there are a lot of other pathways to provide support and treatment that can be effective and can avoid a forced or an involuntary hospitalization. And most of those start with a conversation. A lot of what we've been talking about today is having a conversation. And Javi, what message do you have for caregivers, friends, family around how to start that conversation?
Yeah, I think that starting that conversation can be really scary for caregivers and friends and family. I think that it is a big conversation and sometimes you don't know how to respond. And I think that starting that conversation, first of all, gets easier the more often you do it, and the more often you do those check-ins and start to normalize, hey, like, I'm worried, I want to check in, like, this is something I want to do, then it becomes a lot easier. Obviously, you don't want to also overwhelm this person with checking in, on like an hourly basis. That being said, having open conversations with them about like, what can I do to support you? What would be most helpful right now? And offering things as well, like, do you need some affirmations? Like, do you feel unsafe? Can I take these things away to prevent you from possibly doing harm, like in the film, like they said. And I think that highlighting the other piece of the film, specifically for LGBTQ folks, being a supportive adult in an LGBTQ person's life lowers the risk of suicide by 30%. That's not a small number. And I can even speak for myself. Up until I was 22, I didn't really have any supportive caregivers or supportive people in my life outside of friends. And friends were really what like got me through it. And community in that way is what really got me through it until I could have these conversations with my family and start to educate them a little bit more. So I think that starting the conversation is one thing, but I think also educating yourself about like what that conversation might entail, right? Like, if someone is feeling suicidal because they're getting misgendered every single day and no one sees them how they see themselves, then, you know, saying something like, I see you or something like that might not necessarily be helpful, even though it might feel helpful, because what that person is struggling with is really these systemic and social violences. So being there and sort of sitting there with them and sitting in there with them and providing the supports that would be helpful to them, as opposed to the things that you think would be helpful, I think is a good way to sort of start it. And when you think about it that way, it makes it a little bit easier because it takes a lot of the responsibility off your shoulders to know what to do. Because it's okay to not know what to do, and it's okay to ask the person, like, how can I be helpful? Like, you know, I'm worried, and you know, you might not be a clinician, you might not be trained in all of these things, and yet it's okay to be like, yo, I don't know how to help you, and yet, like, what can I do? Right. And then also educating yourself about what you can do. You know, luckily Google is super accessible. All of those things are super accessible. So just reading up on reputable sites about what is helpful in those moments and what kind of supports, you know, like cooking a meal, like all of those things, I think are really important. So I think that's what I would say about starting that conversation and also continuing it.
Thank you. And Zan, what message do you have for caregivers and friends and family of the people that you're working with around how to start the conversation?
So seize the awkward. The JED Foundation came up with this wonderful phrase, seize the awkward. It is going to be awkward. And there's nothing wrong with the conversation being awkward. It doesn't mean you've stepped in it. It doesn't mean, you know, anything is going amiss. Can be a bumpy path to talk to someone in a way that shows that you care. Only human beings have the capacity to listen in all of the planet and all of the AI, you know, artificial intelligence and all species on the planet. Human beings have this capacity to listen. That is, I think, the single most healing capacity on the planet. And so if you have the capacity to listen and you're interested, you can always get more training. You can always take a course like a QPR, question, persuade, refer, is, you know, one vetted, course for learning how to talk to people about suicide. You can take an emotional first aid or mental health first aid course, something like that. You can look at websites like the JED Foundation, the Steve Fund, which is especially geared toward BIPOC college students, mental health, and the Trevor Project, which is geared toward LGBTQ plus mental health. And but there are resources out there, and we just need to believe in our innate human capacity for the healing power of listening and compassion.
Thank you. And Michael, what message do you have for the people that you're working with around how to start the conversation?
Thank you again, Mark. You know, I think the most significant thing that my wife Gail and I have learned, and a point that I mentioned in my initial remarks, talking about the necessity of speaking about your mental health being as important as your physical health. Conversation, I believe, has to start in the home. And it's one that is not emphasized enough, and particularly in environments in which, you know, your child or children seem to be, you know, extremely mentally healthy, well-adjusted, et cetera. We've got to start that conversation with them, and we need to tell them it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to talk about your problems. Everything isn't going to work out. If I had one thing to do before Keller left for school, even though there wasn't anything sitting right directly in front of him, I think we both would have sat down and said, listen, you're going to experience trauma and problems. You know, reach out to us, reach out to the people that you know at school, to your roommates. If you need professional help, do not be embarrassed to be able to pick up the phone or to walk into an office and ask for help. I think that is so vitally important, and it's the most significant thing that we have learned, and it's been reinforced when we speak in colleges. There is such reluctance to open up and to speak of our problems, and I can hope that that message can get through to everyone that, you know, please start the conversation at home, reinforce it, and let your children be in a position to where they're comfortable and open with talking about things.
Thank you. And Craig, what message do you have for those that you're working with around feeling more empowered to have that conversation?
I think when we talk about military personnel veterans, you know, stigma is an issue that often comes up as a primary barrier to accessing services, receiving treatment. Interestingly, there's newer research. What we understand now is that it's not as much about stigma as we used to think. It's that when we really, in essence, ask what is getting in the way of you seeking out assistance or treatment, the primary reason reported is that service members and veterans say, I would prefer to take care of this on my own. I don't want other people to help me. I kind of want to take care of my own problems. The second most frequently reported barrier is the perspective, actually, I'm doing okay. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm fine. And so we've found that in many ways, maybe we've been sort of barking up the wrong tree in many respects for a long time as we approach these conversations, because we've really kind of assumed that stigma was the primary barrier, when oftentimes it's more of a preference to be sort of self-sufficient, to have that sort of self-determination. And so we've learned that a more useful way to approach these conversations is to talk with service members and veterans about, you know, what's not going so well right now in your life. And I hear and I understand that you want to take care of this on your own. I can resonate with that. I can empathize. I feel the same way in many ways myself. And at the same time, things don't seem to be kind of working out the way that you would like. And so, you know, in many ways, you know, especially those of us who served in the military, we work as teams. You know, Rambo is not a thing. There are no like solitary soldiers who go out and take care of everything themselves. We work in squads, we work in teams. And so being able to tap into sort of the cultural identity and the value system of service members and veterans and say, let's work on this as a squad, let's work on this as a team, we have found, it doesn't help everyone, right? Doesn't work for everyone, but there's a good number of veterans who are like, okay, yeah, let's do that instead. So that's sort of one way that maybe family members, friends, I think fellow veterans, to be able to, I think fellow veterans have street cred with veterans, and oftentimes can have a lot of influence that maybe others in the veteran's life cannot have.
Okay. And that's a great segue into the next question. And looking at as much work as we do to address stigma, not only the stigma still remains, but so do our own biases that we may not be aware of, as well as assumptions about how other people are feeling. That still remains a significant barrier in the work that we do. And so, Javi, in the work that you're doing in your advocacy, how do you see the stigma, those biases, the assumptions factor in?
Yeah, you know, I think that is a daily thing in the work that I do, in terms of the young adults navigating through those biases and assumptions and all of the things that you just mentioned, because, you know, one of the things that I advocate for a lot is competent care, right? There are, as many of us know, there's a huge lack of providers right now across the country, but especially in Massachusetts. But then if you think about amongst those providers, you know, how many of them can provide competent and accurate care to LGBTQ folks? How many of them can provide accurate care to people who are questioning or people who are thinking about medically transitioning, like myself? And so, you know, I think that it's important to be able to provide advocacy in the work that I do to find those spaces for young adults. They are, like, you know, in Massachusetts, thankfully there are more popping up, and they are a little bit more accessible now than they were even 5 years ago. That being said, it's still extremely hard. Wait lists are 6 months, a year, 2 years, you know. And so when you're already picking from a small category of therapists, psychiatrists, doctors, you know, surgeons, all of those things, then you make that circle even smaller for the people who have sort of done the work and can provide that care. It makes it really hard for the young adults to navigate that on their own. You know, like, I have young adults who refuse to go to therapy because they've had such bad experiences with therapists that, you know, being transphobic and doing all of those things, trying to tell them things. And even just the minute ways where people are like, are you sure? You don't seem so sure, all of those things that might not be super helpful. So on top of, you know, working with the young adults and their resilience and finding providers with them, I also do trainings with providers where it's like, you know, let me help you learn these things so your people, your clients, your patients, they don't have to do it themselves. So I think that, yeah, I think that that's a lot of, in the work that I do, in the advocacy that I do with folks, finding accurate care and finding supportive adults within the system to be part of their care teams is super important. And even just seeing me is a huge step for all of them, because though I'm not a therapist or a clinician, you know, I am still part of the system in ways that makes them nervous. So yeah, I think those are all important pieces.
And Zan, with the work that you're doing, what are some steps that you're able to take to address some of the stigma or the biases and assumptions?
Well, to echo what Craig said about, you know, some people will see themselves as, I'm an independent person, I want to take care of this on my own. And there's another maybe similar feeling of, I'm a helper. I'm someone who's a helpful person in the community. For me to need help is a real change in identity. And so for those assumptions that, you know, I will always be the person who's actually giving help and providing for others, or I'm someone who just takes care of my stuff on my own. I think there are approaches to dignify those feelings. Those are very dignified feelings, and to dignify those feelings and at the same time offer, you know, well, even the best ball player has a coach. You know, the coach doesn't play the game for you. The coach just helps you pull the best out of yourself. So I think there are ways of framing coaching and counseling as a, you know, we're not walking this for you. We are, you know, helping you draw the best out of yourself, and you can continue to have the identity of being a helper and an independent person and all those things. And I also think just having peers talk to peers is the single biggest stigma buster of them all. To see students talking to students about, again, their real authentic inner lives, not the social media life, not the curated, you know, external life, but the real inner life is a huge stigma buster.
Okay. And Michael, what are some ways that you've been able to address some of these assumptions and biases?
Again, thank you so much, Marc. I'd like to echo a little bit about Dr. Bryan and what Zan just said, and particularly what Zan just mentioned a moment ago. As it relates to our son, Keller, he was always the fixer. He was always the one mitigating problems. And that particular strength is a wonderful thing to possess, but when you turn it on the opposite side, it makes it very, very, very difficult for someone like him to seek help. These challenges that these young people face are, you know, very, 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 very significant. I agree in the peer-to-peer element of being able to have an open environment in which they can speak to each other and lay out problems. and and potentially get direction to do something. And I think, our telling of Keller's story, an extremely normal, high echelon young man, who was very, very successful, is a barrier. Is an opportunity to knock down a barrier with regard to strength and weakness, and when can I seek help and when do I need help. So I think his story is very indicative of that, and we try to tell it in a manner that would encourage people to step over that line and ask for help. Ask for help from someone that's near them, ask for professional help, take those first steps. And those first steps can put yourself in a position to where you do not lead to that next most fatal step.
Thank you. And Craig, you touched upon this with the last question, but what are some other steps or actions that might help mitigate some of the implications of the assumptions that people make?
Yeah, one other thing I think is really key is we know that one of the kind of best determinants of someone actually taking the step to initiate treatment is the perception that the treatment will work. And if you're going to think about that within the context of stigma, right, where if I don't believe that this potentially stigmatizing action is going to help me, then perhaps it's not worth it to do. If, however, I expect that this, potentially stigmatizing action is going to make things better or make a difference in my life, then maybe the cost benefit ratio shifts and it's worth it anyway. And so this kind of relates to, in many respects, the answer I gave for the first question you asked, why was I motivated to do this? We've learned that a big part of overcoming those barriers to care is really helping people to understand that there are some really effective treatments. No treatment is perfect, doesn't work for everyone, but there's a really good chance that you can achieve the goals that you have, you can make improvements in your life, you can recover, and you can have a meaningful life full of purpose. And we find that can be sort of the tipping point sometimes for many to actually take that next step to make a change in their lives.
And pervasive throughout the film and throughout the discussion today is there's a tremendous message of hope, resilience, and strength coming out of extreme tragic loss. One of the things that I want to ask each of you is, how do we collectively continue to hold the hope? And so I'll start with Javi. What message do you have for the audience today about how do we hold the hope?
Yeah, I think in terms of how do we hold the hope for things getting better, for young adults, for the situations that folks are in, I think that part of the way we do that is especially when I'm speaking for LGBTQ trans queer communities, is when you look out, which is hard, right? When you're feeling these ways, it's hard to look out, and because you're feeling all these things within, and those things are really hard. But when you do look out, there are a lot of us, and there are a lot more of us every day, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that, as especially Black trans communities, we go through a lot. I don't know, I'm not even sure what number of Black trans people who have been murdered so far this year we're on. But that being said, we're out here, we're becoming much more accepted by a lot of people. And even though we have a lot of ugly things going around the country right now with legislature, there are people and places that are safe. And I think that is really important. And it's important to realize that there is safety, and there are people who understand, and there are people who are like you, who look like you, you know, who talk like you, who even might be going through similar things in the brain that you might be going through, you know, because that's, I think, as we were talking about the peer role, I think that is also really important outside of a formal setting when we're talking about peers who are just friends going through things as well. And so I think that we hold the hope, to put that simply, we hold the hope by being in community, and by realizing that we are not alone. And even though it might feel that way, putting ourselves in situations where we can, to remind ourselves that there are people who love us for simply who we are and not what we do and not what we contribute and not all of those things, but just who we are, even and especially when we're laying in bed and can't get up, you know? So I think that for me is a lot of where we hold the hope.
And Zan, what message do you have to hold the hope?
I think everybody on this panel represents the hope, and are living embodiments of hope. And the whole film is a testament to hope. So we just need to, you know, open our ears and eyes, or open our senses a little bit to feel that it's there, right in the atmosphere. But specifically, knowing that the treatments work, knowing that the treatments are there for you whenever you are ready to, you know, open that door, and knowing that you're never alone. That holds the hope.
And Michael, what message do you have for the audience?
I think hope without action is won't work. Action, I believe, is the most important thing here. And what I mean by that is quite simply, we need to reinforce our emphasis on mental health, particularly in high school and colleges. And it can't be just a once a year deal. It really needs to permeate the entire, you know, living experience at a high school or college. It needs to be brought out, obviously, in the classroom. It's got to be brought out by the administration. We just can't check a box and say every 2 years we get a mental health speaker, or in orientation, we tell you you need to watch out for yourself and be careful about what your mental condition is, and here are the resources. This has to be emphasized on a regular basis. And I've seen a distinct change in the last 5 or 6 years that I've been going around American campuses. There's a lot more participation in this, a lot more activity in this, a lot more openness in this, and that's extremely encouraging to me. You know, I know our numbers are not going down like they should, but I believe that we're in a state right now where it is much more acceptable to have these discussions. It is much more acceptable for peer-to-peers to speak to each other. And I think if we can just emphasize that more and more and make it an absolute part of existence at colleges and high schools, we're going to make a substantial difference. And then I think that our hope rests in communication.
Wonderful. And Craig?
For me, I think when I think of the answer to this question, I'm sort of reflecting upon the progress we've made on, you know, as researchers, as scientists, to improve, refine, develop treatments. And, you know, in the film, we follow the story of two veterans going through an intensive trauma-focused therapy delivered over the course of 2 weeks. And, you know, several years ago when I was first in graduate school, you know, 15 years or so ago, the idea that you could treat PTSD in 2 weeks would have just been ludicrous. It would have been like you're absolutely, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. And now this is sort of like an increasing norm, and there's movement with a lot of the trauma therapy developers. We're starting to move towards this should actually be the norm, this like really aggressive short-term treatment, because we actually get better results when we do it that way as compared to some of the more classic, you know, weekly or every other week therapy modalities. And I'll even say, kind of related to this theme, just within the past week, the first study has been published showing 1 week treatment, taking the 2 weeks and then compressing it even shorter, where you do 2 sessions a day instead of 1 session a day, and that works really well. And so we're now looking at, we keep tweaking and modifying, combining the therapies with other things, and we're getting just a little bit better each time. Sometimes it seems really slow and it's just not happening fast enough, but where we're at now compared to, for instance, Roger, a Vietnam vet, none of this existed. There's nothing available. And now we're getting 75% recovery rates fairly consistently. And I think several years from now, probably the things we do today that are so-called best practices, I hope are not best practices anymore. And probably 40 or 50 years from now, they're going to look back at what we do today and they're going to say, man, how archaic, like where were they? But I see that as that upward trajectory that's very hopeful, because keeping that in perspective, I think there's a lot to be very hopeful about.
And we have some questions from the audience. Zan, what should a parent know before sending their children off to college, and what resources would you have in this area?
So I think either depending on how motivated the student is, or the, if not, then the parent, to look into what mental health supports are available. What is the atmosphere like in the dorm culture? Find out a little bit about that. Find out what the after hours kinds of emergency services are. What do I do at 3 o'clock in the morning when, there's a concern? Just to have a little bit of a, and again, depending on how interested the college student is in this, to have a little bit of a conversation about, like, here's a game plan, set up a few different action steps and different scenarios that might be helpful to that student or their peers. And that student will be a little bit ahead of the game when they arrive by having had that action plan laid out.
Wonderful. And Michael, from your perspective, what should a parent know before sending their children off to college?
I think much like Zan said, they need to be aware of the resources that are available both at the university and the community, and emphasize those with their child before they go to school and become familiar with them. I think that is the absolute most important thing. As I think the film indicated, Keller made 5 unsuccessful phone calls to hospitals both in Baton Rouge and actually in Atlanta, Georgia, before he took his life. And just knowing the local resource within the Baton Rouge community or the LSU community literally made the difference between life and death. So that is one of the things that I would emphasize to any parent, to have that conversation with their child and to understand those resources and have those resources handy for them to be able to help them in a time of need, because a simple call, a call for life, could have actually saved Keller's life.
And Javi, are you aware of about how available treatments such as CPT work for BIPOC or people of other cultural backgrounds?
I am not currently aware of, CPT and those kinds of things. I do know that, interestingly enough, I do know systems like IFS. I think it's the interfamily system, which talks about our feelings as like different parts of us. I know that systems like that have been super successful. I know that CBT has also been super successful for some trans folks in terms of processing how they're navigating their gender identity, especially if they're moving through things like going from a more feminine identity to a more masculine identity, or from a more masculine identity to a more feminine identity, processing all of those thoughts that contribute to that. I know CBT has been really helpful for that. And then for the feelings that come up like dysphoria and all of those things, I know IFS has been really helpful for that as well. Though I know that there isn't too much research on IFS, I know it's something that's becoming much more widely available. And I think that it can really depend on the person and their situation, right? Because unfortunately, as I mentioned, there are some places that are safer than others for trans people and for queer people and for like Black folks. And so I think that, you know, when we're talking about what people need, I think that especially with these identities, it really is contextual because it depends on what type of violences they're going to experience, and it depends on what their day-to-day looks like and how accessible treatment outside of just strictly mental health treatment, outside of that, like how accessible is medical care that is competent and all of those things. So like I said, CBT and IFS, and I think DBT has also been known they've been known to be really useful for queer, trans folks and Black folks as well.
And Craig, I know that you're very familiar with the CBT. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah. So the research base supporting CBT across cultures, across even different demographic groups is fairly robust. There's, for instance, I had a former postdoc who even translated the CBT materials into Khmer and went over to Cambodia and worked with youths who were sort of rescued from the commercial sex trade system. And so CPT has been tested in multiple languages with multiple groups. It's been delivered, it's been tested in group therapy format, individual therapy format, and so it's been shown to be remarkably effective. And now some of the newer research that's coming out is even looking at the effectiveness of CBT for race-based trauma as well as historical trauma, which is especially relevant, the latter being especially relevant for like First Nation, Native American communities as well. So I think it's one of those things where this is, I think CBT is really kind of a great example of how a lot of researchers and clinicians have been able to collaborate with different groups with lived experiences from different communities to continue to refine and tweak to the unique needs of a wide and diverse range of populations.
Thank you. And this next question is for both Craig and Michael around, are you observing any increase in access to services in other states? Michael, are you seeing an increase at all?
I'm sorry, I couldn't understand those last words. I apologize.
Are you observing any increases in access to services in other states?
Yeah, I have, not universal, but my travels have brought me all across the country, and I do see a greater access, to services, and that's a very encouraging sign. Now, those services are challenged a lot. There's a lot of people trying to get in, so it's always one step behind. But no, I do see an increased emphasis and for that type of help.
Craig, are you seeing an increase in access?
Yeah, so one of the interesting sort of consequences of COVID was this very pronounced shift towards telehealth-based services across probably the entire world, not just the US. And state licensing boards relaxed a lot of the strict regulations around, for instance, crossing state lines. So if you're, if you live kind of on the border of two states, it might be that as a healthcare provider, your patient lives on one side of the imaginary line or the invisible line, and you couldn't previously, before the pandemic, deliver telehealth services to that person. And so, interestingly enough, during COVID, there has been a sharp increase in access to mental health care services. And it's largely because with the advent of telehealth and virtual-based therapy, it's easier to access services. Now, when we look at sort of surveys of consumers of healthcare services as well as the providers, there's this interesting gap that seems to be emerging. There's the majority of the mental health professionals are saying, we can't wait for the pandemic to end so we can go back to face-to-face therapy. But the majority of patients are saying, no, we don't want to go back. Like, it's super convenient to not have to drive across town, sit in your waiting room, take time off of work, things like that. And so I think there will be a shift in how mental health services are delivered into the future, I think for the good. The major concern that many of us have is that already licensing boards are now getting rid of some of those relaxed standards. So it's becoming harder once again to cross jurisdictional lines, which I think will push us back towards where things were before, which is not good for suicide prevention and for mental health services as well. And so I think that's probably going to be perhaps a hot issue in the mental health community over the coming years, is advocating more for nationalization of licensing standards so that people have more choice on who they're receiving services from. It makes access to care a lot easier, especially for those in rural or low resourced, under-resourced areas.
Thank you. And the next question is for me. Are you aware of any resources of how to start the conversation with younger children, elementary school age? There are a lot of resources available, and I think that it really depends on your location and how to access those resources. Javi had mentioned Google earlier. That's probably the best place to start. But I would say this, I think approaching the conversation is from a place of authenticity and validation. Being mindful that all behavior has meaning and communicates something. We want to try and understand that the best that we can, and have those open, honest, and authentic conversations. Zan, I'm wondering, do you have any particular resources that you're aware of?
So I'm don't know much about the young children's side, but I would say there are many curricula or parent guides about how to teach kids to be more well-resourced in terms of feeling their emotions and containing their emotions and learning how to use the body as a resource through breathing or mindfulness or exercise and play as a form of discharge. There are lots of ways that kids, I think, are naturally good at using their bodies as a resource. And if we can teach them emotion words and start to get them to identify emotions, that will serve them well for the rest of their lives.
Wonderful. And Zan, the next question is for you. As a friend, how can you set healthy boundaries and help somebody who's already receiving treatments in community services but is not making any progress?
So the boundaries question. It is important to know what your limits are. It's very important not to let yourself go down that slippery slope of caregiver burnout. So if you start to notice that you're not getting your own daily activities done, you're not getting your things completed or finishing your chores because you're helping them, get their lives in order. That's one of those signs of a slippery slope to caregiver burnout. If you've flipped from feeling more compassionate and caring to feeling more resentful, it's not a sign that you're a bad person. That's also a sign of burnout, of caregiver burnout, that, it's a kind of the mind starts to get a little bit jaded or a kind of feeling more callous, just as a form of self-protection if you're getting caregiver burnout. So the first, kind of step to that is to notice and name, I think I might be on that slippery slope to caregiver burnout. Then you could think about what other resources could be brought to bear in this situation. If you ever feel like you're handling it all alone, start to brainstorm with perhaps there's another friend or someone else invested in the situation. If you are someone who's close enough to know who the treatment treatment provider is, who the therapist is. You can always feed information to the treatment provider. They can't tell you anything about what's happening in the treatment, but you can always reach out with those kinds of concerns if that's fits the situation. And if the person who you're concerned about is not super fragile, if they're super fragile, we need to get them immediate kind of first aid care, emotional health care. But if they're not in a super fragile state, and you can have a conversation about, it seems like this stuff is still really weighing on you and still really heavy for you. Who else, start to brainstorm with them. Who else is helpful? Your siblings, your, other people who you're close to in your life, your clergy, are there other people who could start to be part of the dream team around, helping to walk with this person through the difficult time?
Thank you. And on that, this concludes this portion of our discussion, and I want to thank all of the panelists today. The work that you do is so tremendously important, and thank you. I don't have the words to express enough of how much I appreciate the work that you're doing and how helpful it is to everybody. Please enjoy a 30-minute break and return promptly at 12:20 for the next film, The Definition of Insanity, and that will be followed by a panel discussion as well. Thank you.
Everyone.
Hi, thanks everyone.
Thank you.